All right, welcome back. We are on page 2 of the Unit 5 final exam review. We're still looking at identities, and now we're going to look at verifying identities. So remember, when we verify, we want the left side of that equation to equal what is given on the right side. So for number 10, we have secant squared x minus 1 over secant squared x, and we want it to equal sine squared x. First thing I'm going to do, again, look at my identity sheet, see if I have any identities that would help, or I could look at this fraction as two separate fractions. So since I have secant x minus 1, both over secant squared x, we have secant squared x minus 1, both over secant squared x. I can separate those into two fractions. Okay. This just becomes 1. And this is the reciprocal, so I can write it as cosine squared x. And what is cosine squared x, or 1 minus cosine squared x? Sine squared x, which is exactly what we want it to equal. Okay. Number 2, we have lots of identities here. Okay, I see this one jumps out at me right away, that cosine of pi minus 2 minus theta. If I look on my identity sheet, okay, and we talked about that on page 1, that is just sine of theta. Okay, cosecant of negative theta is the same thing as negative cosecant theta. And then finally on the bottom we have cotangent of negative theta, which is the same as negative cotangent theta. All three of those are found on your identity sheet. Okay. A negative over a negative is just going to become positive. So I'm going to look at what I have going on the top here. I have sine of theta times 1 over sine of theta, the reciprocal. Okay, and that just gives me 1. So I have 1 over cotangent theta. And 1 over cotangent theta is just tangent theta, which is exactly what I want it to equal. Okay, again, all of those I just got right from the identity sheet. Okay. Number 12, because I have a plus sign here, I can't just break that up like I did here. Okay, so I have to look at this bottom and see what I can possibly do with that. Okay, so the first thing I might do is change those from cotangent and tangent to in terms of cosine and sine. So cosine over sine and sine over cosine. And in order to add those together, they need to have like denominators. So since this has a sign, this needs sine. Remember, when we multiply fractions, we need to multiply the top and bottom. When we multiply to get common denominators, we need to multiply the top and bottom. Since this has cosine, this needs cosine as well, top and bottom. Okay, so I'm not changing anything with this cosecant on top yet. Okay, this gives me cosine squared x all over cosine x sine x. This gives me sine squared x. Then I can look on my identity sheet. Cosine squared plus sine squared is just 1. Okay, so now what I really have is cosecant x over 1 over cosine sine. But I can flip that and multiply. Okay, since this is division, I can flip it and multiply. All right, so my next thing I might do is change, oops, I just used that color, change this cosecant to 1 over sine. And then that helps me because my sines then cancel out and I'm just left with cosine x, which is what I wanted that identity to equal. Okay, so that one was definitely more work. Two big things here when we're adding fractions. Okay, we need to have common denominators. And when we get common denominators, we have to multiply both the top and the bottom by whatever's missing. All right, and finally here, we have 1 plus tangent x over sine x minus secant x, and we want it to equal cosecant x. Okay, so there's a few different ways you can try this. I might just start looking at the fact that I have tangent here and I have sine on the bottom. So maybe if I write that in terms of sine and cosine, and if I'm writing things in terms of sine and cosine, then I might also do that with that secant. Okay. Unfortunately, one is sine x, one is cosine x in the denominator, so I can't add those together unless I get common denominators. So since this has sine x, this needs sine x, and I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom. Since this has cosine x, I'm going to multiply the top and the bottom. So I know that my common denominator, cosine x, sine x, is going to be on the bottom there. I can distribute this, cosine x. When I distribute here, the cosines cancel, leaving me with just sine. And be careful of this negative. That's a -1 sine, which gives me a negative sine x. Okay, our sines cancel out, and I'm left with just a cosine over cosine times sine, and our cosines also cancel out, leaving me with 1 over sine. And finally, 1 over sine is cosecant. I'm going to double check. Yep, that is exactly what I want it to equal. Okay. All right, that's the end of page 2, which is all verifying identities. Go ahead and try the next video for page